In this video, I'm going to give you a primer about HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and Bootstrap. If you already know these topics, you're welcome to watch and see if you learn anything new, but you can feel free to skip this lecture as well. I'm of the opinion that you need to have some idea of the technologies that make up a typical modern web application. So I'm going to go through those quickly in this lecture. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and it's a language similar to XML, which defines the contents of a web page in a semantic way. And it does this using a DOM, which is a document object model that contains tags and attributes. And we'll learn more about those in a minute. Now, since HTML defines the contents of the web page, we need something like CSS, which is cascading style sheets, to provide the look and feel of that web page. CSS offers us classes that specify the size and position and color and borders of elements on the web page. So what we do is we apply CSS classes to the various HTML tags that comprise our web page. So while HTML and CSS are both relatively static markup languages, JavaScript is an object-oriented scripting language that allows us to manipulate the DOM and cause things to happen on the web page. Whether it's processing an input form, or moving things around on the page in an animation, or creating hover effects when you roll your cursor over something, those are things that JavaScript can do. It's a very popular scripting language. It's most often used on the client side, which means it executes in the browser that lives on your computer, but it can also be used on the server side in certain technology stacks. Now, Bootstrap is a framework. Bootstrap makes it easier to create web applications. And it does this by providing libraries that contain HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And you can find out more information about it at getbootstrap.com. So let's dig a little bit deeper on HTML. As I mentioned, HTML defines the contents of a web page. And it does this using tags. And these tags are going to be part one of our locators. The tags themselves provide semantic meaning about the document. They're essentially delimiters that mark the beginning and end of content. Some examples of tags are head, body, header, article, section, div, P, which stands for paragraph, span, UL, which is an unordered list, basically a bullet list, LI is a list item that goes into the bullet list, table, and footer. And you can see that I have a 1 next to head and body. And the reason why that's there is because you only ever have one head and one body in any given web page. And tags generally look like what you see here. You'll have angle brackets that surround the tag itself. And you'll see that we have a beginning tag and an ending tag. The difference between the beginning and ending tag is the slash that you see in the ending tag. As I mentioned, the beginning of the body tag and the end of the body tag are delimiters that mark the beginning and end of content. In this case, you see the words some stuff. That's the content of the body of our web page. So you have an opening tag, which delimits the beginning, and an ending tag, which delimits the end. Some tags don't have two parts to them, like this beginning and end body you see, but they're more like this image tag here, where you still see those angle brackets, but the only thing inside the angle brackets is the name of the tag and what we call an attribute. This one is an image tag, which represents an image on a web page, and we're providing an attribute, which is the URL where this image lives. And you can Google W3 School's HTML tag reference for more information about HTML tags. Attributes are bits of information that we put inside the angle brackets of the tags. And these attributes are part 2 of our locators. So when we get to the point we're talking about CSS and XPath locators, we're going to be talking about tags and attributes. So it's very important that you know and understand the difference between these things. There are some official attributes that can be included in some of our tags. And to see a list of those, you can Google W3 School's HTML attributes reference. But some of those official attributes include ID, title, name, href, source, type, and class. And class, of course, pertains to CSS classes, and we'll cover that in more detail in a few minutes. The HTML specification also allows us to add custom attributes to HTML tags if we want to. The correct way to do that is to prefix the name of your attribute with data dash. So we could say data-testerinfo equals some value. And this is something the developers can do for us if we tell them, hey, can you please add some kind of an attribute to a particular tag on a page that might be especially challenging to locate. And they can add that custom attribute to the tag so you can more easily find it. That's not usually necessary though, because there are so many powerful ways to locate things once you know what you're doing. The document object model is really just the end result of the presence of these tags and attributes. It's essentially a data structure, a structured representation of a document as a tree. And by tree, I mean that you have parent and child relationships between the tags. The DOM also goes as far as to provide methods or functions that allow access to the tree. You can add and remove items, you can interrogate the value of items, and so on. So if you've never seen HTML before, I know all this information is probably relatively mind-numbing and generic. So let's jump over to PyCharm and try a couple of examples that will give you a more clear idea of how tags and attributes actually work. So I've got PyCharm open and I'm creating a new project in my C development HTML directory. And I'll just call this HTML demo. I will right click here and create a new file. I'm going to call it index.htm. Click OK. And that's all it takes to create a static web page. As we just learned, in order to create HTML content, we use tags. And tags always begin with this angle bracket, which is the less than sign. And in order to create a valid HTML document, one of the first tags you use is the HTML tag, which says, hey, this document has HTML in it. And this tag I'm typing right now is the opening HTML tag. And you'll notice when I add the greater than symbol to close this specific tag, PyCharm automatically inserts the corresponding closing tag, which has that slash in it we just talked about. Now, the general convention is to use your return key and create space between these two tags, because the assumption is there will be additional tags that go inside of here. And you may recall that I said that these HTML tags are merely delimiters that mark the beginning and end of some kind of content. So this is the beginning of our HTML content, and this is the end of our HTML content. HTML documents are expected to have what's called a head section. And I create that by opening up a tag, typing the word head, and these tags should all be lowercase, by the way. When I use the greater than symbol to close this starting head tag, you'll see I get a corresponding closing head tag. Again, I use a couple of returns. And now something that I want to call out is that this head tag here is what's called a child of the HTML tag. The HTML tag is the parent, and since the head tag is inside the HTML tag, the head tag is referred to as a child of the HTML tag. Another thing that all HTML files have is a body tag. So I open up another tag here and type the word body. And you'll see when I close that, my ending body tag appears. So I hit a couple of returns there. And notice that I've used tabs to indent my child tags. That's a convention that people typically use when creating HTML files. It simply gives us a clear visual ability to tell where the start and end of certain tags are. Now, we talked before about how this pair of head tags here is a child of the HTML tag, so you should also be able to glean from that the body tag is also a child of the HTML tag. And now, since both head and body are children of the HTML tag, that makes head and body what we call siblings of one another, because they share the same parent. Hopefully that makes sense. And you're going to need to know this parent-child and siblings relationship when we start talking about locators. So we've just discussed the fact that HTML is a tag, head is a tag, and body is a tag. If I go ahead and open this up in Firefox, for instance, we see absolutely nothing because there's really no content to view. If I was to add some text here, like this is the body of my web page, and now if I hover over here and open in Firefox, I should see some text on the page. And there it is. It's very ugly, but it says this is the body of my web page. Notice up here, there's no title on this. So something that most web pages have is a title, whether it's the title on the tab or on the window itself. So I'm going to hit two tabs to indent even further here, and I'm going to type the word title, because that's actually a type of tag. It's a little confusing because title is also an attribute that can be used inside of tags, but title itself can also be a tag. So if I type in now, this is the title of my web page, and then I hover over this and I click on Firefox to preview, You can see now up here in the tab, it says this is the title of my web page. It's a little cut off here, but you can see that my title tag is now reflecting itself up here in the tab. Another very popular tag to use inside of the body, and again I'll indent one more, would be a tag called H1. And you can see that that gives me a beginning and ending of the H1 tag. And inside of that tag, I can type in something like about this website. And that is going to be rendered a special way because of the fact that it's an H1 tag. So if we preview now, you see that that's much larger and more bold now because the H1 tag has a special meaning and is rendered a certain way by the browser. So another popular tag you're going to see a lot is a div tag. And all a div tag is just a section of content. It really has no meaning above and beyond that. So here I can type I am div1, and I'll copy and paste that and add another child div here underneath body. So this div and that div are siblings. And when I preview this in Firefox, you can see nothing magical happens. It just says I am div1, I am div2. And there's really no space between those things. Now the way things usually happen is that inside of a body, there will be a div like this that has a start and an end, and the paragraph tag will be used a lot. So now paragraph, I'll say this is paragraph 1, and I've got a beginning and an end, and I'll copy and paste that, and I'll say this is paragraph 2. And now when I render this in Firefox, you can see because of the fact that I used paragraph tags inside my div tag, now the browser is rendering that with more space between them. So that's helpful. When we look at this, there isn't a lot of semantic meaning here. If you know that H1 represents a header of the first and largest size, then you can at least know that, hey, I've got a body here and it's got a header and it's got a section of content in this div and there's 2 paragraphs. But what if I wanted to represent the fact that my web page has a header area and then a navigation area and then a content area and a footer area? HTML5 introduced a tag called header. And I'll just type in, this is my header. And then below that header, I'm using an H1 here and a div, which represents some content. So the fact that that tag is called a header tag gives us some semantic meaning. And now maybe down here at the bottom, after my content, I can add a new tag here called footer. And I'll say this is my footer. So when I render this now, again, nothing magical happens. I just have my header text and my footer text, my content area and my H1. But the point is, these tags like header and footer have provided some semantic meaning to us. And it potentially makes your job as a test automator easier because you can get points of reference by reading these tags. So as we talked about, tags are the first aspect of our locators. And when we start discussing CSS and XPath locators, you'll see why it's important to understand how tags work. Let's have a quick look at attributes. There are some official attributes like ID, title, name, href, and so on. All that means is that we're going to go into something like the div tag here, and I'll add a space, and I'll start typing I, and you can see that I get a drop-down here of potential attributes. And when I double-click on ID, it gives me the syntax for what an attribute should look like. And this attribute value can really be anything. Again, it should be lowercase, and I use hyphens to separate multiple words. So my ID for this will just be called a cool div. So the fact that I've added an ID to my div doesn't do anything in the rendering. When I go and open this up, you can see that I don't see anything in here about my cool div. But if I right click on this and I inspect the element, you can see that down here in the HTML markup, I can see the presence of that ID. And we can use that ID attribute very effectively as a locator. And we'll see more about that in a few minutes. But oftentimes you're going to find that developers aren't willing to put those IDs on there. So you won't always be guaranteed that there will be an ID available for you in any given tag. Another commonly used attribute is what's called the name attribute. So if I type in name equals a cool name, again, that's going to have no impact on the rendering of the page, but it adds some kind of semantic meaning to what this div is for. I'll add one more div here, and I'll say that another very common tag to use is what's called the A tag. And this is actually a hyperlink. So if I type in A and I start typing HR, you can see that href is an attribute we can use. And if I double click on that, I can put a URL value in there. And then when I close off the opening of this tag, you can see that the closing tag jumps in, which gives me an opportunity to type something here that represents what the user will see for this link. I'll just type in this is a link. So what I've done here is I've added an A tag, which is short for anchor. It just means hyperlink or a link. And I've provided an attribute for that A tag called href. And then I have some text. So this is the text value that is contained inside this tag. And when I render this, you can see that I get a hyperlink here. And if I click on that, it will actually take me to the Amazon website. Now there's another attribute that I could put inside this A tag here. And in order to do that, I just click after this first attribute and I put a space in. And I can type in TAR and I get this target attribute. And when I double click on that, notice it's giving me a series of options that I could use for this target tag. So if I use _blank in this case, something different is going to happen when I click on this link. So we render in Firefox. And this time when I click on the link, you see that it opened a new tab instead of navigating away from the website like it did before. So now you've had some practical experience seeing what HTML tags look like and attributes as well. And like I said, when we talk about CSS and XPath locators, we're going to be making use of those tags and attributes. I want to give you a high-level overview of the various ways these tags can be used to structure an HTML document. So this represents an entire web page, and you can see at the top we've got a header tag, and then a nav tag, and then on the left we've got an article which contains a section tag, and on the right side we've got an aside tag, which is also an HTML tag which adds semantic meaning. And then down at the bottom, we've got that footer. So the key thing to notice here is that we have a header and a footer and a nav at the top. Notice this one also has the header at the top and the nav at the top, but this time the article itself has a header and a footer. So we're not just constrained to using the header and the footer at the top and bottom of the page only. Header and footer can also be used in the context of something like an article. So notice we've got header and then we've got section 1 and section 2. The header and the section and the footer are all child tags inside the article tag. In this case, we've got a header at the top and a footer at the bottom of the page. And we also, in the middle, have a section which contains a header and a footer with an article inside. So last time you saw that the article had a header and a footer, but this time you see that we have a section that has a header and a footer and an article inside the section. And now we see the nav is on the left side, whereas before the nav was on top. So now you may recall that I said that CSS is responsible for the look and feel of a web page. You've seen that we typically lay all these tags out in a linear fashion. We don't have anything on the left or on the right with these tags. It all goes from top to bottom. So with CSS, we use classes to specify the size and position and color and borders of the elements. So on the left side, you can see that our intention is to have 6 different sections of the web page. We want to have a banner, we want to have a content wrapper, main content, and a left sidebar and a right sidebar and a footer. But notice that left sidebar and right sidebar are on top of one another, because that's the only way that we can write them out in an HTML file. So now what we do is we use CSS classes to take things like this left sidebar and right sidebar, which are 4 and 5 respectively, and we use CSS classes to position the left sidebar and the right sidebar on the left side and the right side of the page respectively. So that's what CSS is good for. Size, shape, positions, all that stuff. And the way that would work is if we added a div here and called this left sidebar content, and then we duplicated that div and called this right sidebar content, the way that we put this on the left and this on the right is by using classes. So we would say class equals, and then we would put the name of a class that has been implemented in some other CSS file, and maybe that class would be called left sidebar. So we've added an attribute to this tag called class, and we've assigned the value of left sidebar to this attribute. And if this class was properly defined using CSS, then this text left sidebar content would float to the side like this one is doing over here. And then we would do something very similar here. We would say div class equals, and we'd say right sidebar. And now this text here would float to the right side the way this one is doing. So that's the HTML CSS relationship. And CSS goes beyond layout like that. CSS can also change the colors and the Z order, which means the front to back order of things, so it can look like things are layered and overlapping things, and so on. Okay, so now we're in the home stretch. Let's talk about Bootstrap basics. Bootstrap was released in 2011, and it's a collection of CSS plus JavaScript libraries that speed up web development. And essentially what it does is it provides top-level containers. And by containers, I mean a div and a class that surrounds the entire web page that defines whether the web page is a fixed width or what's called a fluid width. And in a fluid width, when you resize the browser, the content also grows and shrinks. Whereas with a fixed width, even when you increase and decrease the width of the browser, the web page stays the same size right in the center of the browser. It also provides a variety of time-saving classes that can be applied to various tags. And those classes will either have an impact of styling or something cosmetic, or something functional, or both. Bootstrap also provides lots of icons and a wide variety of styling features that make web pages just look better. It also facilitates what's called a responsive design using a grid system. And what I mean by responsive design is make note of these menus here and the size of this logo and this big section of text here as I go from a desktop size browser to a tablet size browser and then finally down to a mobile size browser. You see there's a breakpoint where this top set of menus collapses into what they call a hamburger icon here. So here's the full menu. And then as I go a little bit more narrow, now the menu has collapsed here. When you click on this, you see the menu in here. So all this is being done automatically by Bootstrap. And notice that text in the middle is shrinking down. And this menu list down here, if I expand this out wider now, you can see that the menu now has an image next to it. And if I shrink it back down again, there's a point where that image drops down beneath the menu items. Open it back up, and now that image is next to the menu items again. So those are the kind of neat tricks that Bootstrap can do. For more information about Bootstrap, you can Google W3 Schools Bootstrap, and they have some great beginner's information for you there. You can also visit getbootstrap.com, and they have a lot of great assets there. So let's have a quick live demo of how easily Bootstrap can make a web page look. So to demonstrate how Bootstrap works, I've fleshed out the HTML example we were working on before. So it still has the head with a title and the body with a header area in H1. It's got a div with 2 paragraphs of sample text here, and another div with a paragraph and a link, and then a paragraph with an unordered list with 3 list items, and then another paragraph with a table that contains a table head and a table body. And the table head is going to be the first row, which represents the column names, and then the table body has column data. And then at the very bottom, we've got the footer here. So if I render that in a browser without Bootstrap, it certainly is not beautiful. You can see that the font is not something that you would see on a modern website. If I hover over the link, nothing interesting happens. My list items have bullet points, and my table just looks kind of blah. So let's see what it takes to add Bootstrap to this. All I need to do is jump up here into my head and copy and paste a few lines in that I got from the Bootstrap website. This first line just basically says that the initial scale is 1, and that helps the browser understand that we're viewing it from something the size of a desktop. Then what we're doing here is we're linking in a CSS style sheet, which lives on the Bootstrap server. So you can see that file name ends in .css. So there's a bunch of styles in there. And then what we're doing is we're adding in 2 JavaScript files, one of which is a jQuery JavaScript file, and the other one is the Bootstrap JavaScript file. So just by adding in those 4 lines in my head here, I'm going to back them up to match the other child. Let's go ahead and render this in a browser and see if it looks any different. So right off the bat, you see that the most notable thing that changed is the font. If I hover over my link, now I have this underlined thing that happens here. My list still looks similar, and my table isn't necessarily beautiful, but the font is better. Let's see if we can make some better changes. Like I said, Bootstrap supplies classes that can have very dramatic cosmetic effects, and those things live in this Bootstrap CSS file. So for instance, if I jump down here to my table, and in my table tag here, I add an attribute called class, and I say class equals, and I type the word table, that is a CSS class that I'm getting from the Bootstrap package. So let's go ahead and preview in a browser and see if that made any changes. So you can see the dramatic impact that had. All I did was added a class to my table tag, and suddenly this table looks like something you potentially would see in a production website. And the way CSS classes work is that you can stack them up. So along with the table class, I can say table-bordered So now I've added a second class into this class attribute. And if we preview now, we're getting the impact of the first class plus the second class. So now I have a border around the table. But you'll notice if I hover my cursor over the table, nothing interesting happens. So I can go in here and add an additional class, table-hover. And now when I refresh the page, I've got my border. And now you can see that each of the rows highlights as I hover over that. So Bootstrap has not only given me some cosmetic benefits, now it's also giving me some functional benefits. I guess you could consider this to be cosmetic as well, but to me, anytime something dynamic happens, I consider that to be functional. We could take it one step farther by adding a fourth class called table-striped. And now when I preview, you can see that the first and the third row are darker than the second row. And when I hover over them, they still do the dynamic color change from table-hover. I talked about this notion of Bootstrap giving us some top-level containers, so let's see what happens if we add a container to this page. Adding a page-level container simply means that I'm going to pop in here and add a div, and I'll grab my ending div tag, cut that, and I'll put it all the way down here at the end of my content, including the footer. And I'll grab all this content here and indent it a little bit more, indent this one, and now adding that div did nothing. As you'll see when I preview in a browser, it still looks exactly the same. But now what I can do is I can add a class attribute to this div called container, and when we preview now you can see that I actually have margins around the outside of the website. So it kind of squeezes the content in a little bit. And notice if I change the width of the browser, the space of that container changes as well. So depending upon the size of the browser window, the container size is going to adapt. So this is what we would refer to as a fluid layout. To demonstrate one more cool feature of Bootstrap, I'm adding another p tag here, and I'll add a class called button, and we'll call this button1, and we'll add another one here called button2. And when we render this in a browser, we can see we get these relatively generic looking buttons. And if we render it in Chrome, let's see if they're similar or different. There's Firefox, there's Chrome, nothing spectacular. But if I jump into this tag here, and I add a class attribute like usual, and I add the btn class, which comes from Bootstrap, I'll actually apply that to both buttons and see what kind of an impact that has. We'll render it. So you can see that they changed into these gray buttons, which isn't a whole lot better, but they don't look like those default silvery buttons, so I think that's a step forward. Now if I add a second class called btn-primary to this one, and I add a second class here called btn-success, and we render it now, this actually may be something more like you've seen in modern web applications. And now notice along with the cosmetic style, I got that functional rollover stuff going on as well. And I didn't have to do a lot of hard CSS styling work for this. All I did was to attach 2 Bootstrap classes to each button, and I got that stuff for free. Let's have a look in Chrome. The same thing happens. And we'll also take a peek in IE. And notice it renders and does the same thing in IE as well. Our table looks nice, got our rollovers. So you can see this is starting to shape up. So now I'm going to summarize with this slide here again, and hopefully it'll make more sense to you now that we've gone through those examples. HTML defines the contents of a web page in a meaningful semantic way. It gives us tags and attributes that we use to build up the structure of the document. CSS comes along and puts styles on things, changes colors, moves things to the left or to the right or to the center, size, position, color, borders, all that stuff. JavaScript is a scripting language that allows action to take place. Finally, Bootstrap rolls all those things up together in a nice tidy package and makes web development significantly easier and faster. The reason why I'm showing you this is because I want you to be familiar and comfortable with all the moving parts behind the scenes of any given modern web page. So for instance, when we go in here and we want to find locators for all these kinds of things, it might be a little bit overwhelming when you just right-click in here and you inspect element and you see all this crazy content in here. But now, if you go up here to the head, you're going to see that we've got a head tag. We've got a title tag inside that head tag. Here's where we're linking in that Bootstrap CSS file. And there are a few other CSS files that are being pulled in. There's our body. And we've got a div with an ID attribute of wrapper. we can see we have a nav tag with a Bootstrap class of navbar and navbar default and navbar static top. And then as I scroll further down the page here onto any one of these tables and right click on one of them, you can see that I have my table tag and it has an ID and it also has this class. And by now, these Bootstrap classes should look familiar to you. We've got a table class and table striped, table bordered, table hover. All the same classes we used in our simple example were used in this more complex example. You can see the even odd highlighting. You can see the rollover, all the same things my table was doing. And if we scroll down a little further, we see a table like this and we right click on this guy. And this one just has a table with a class of table. So these color stripes are coming from somewhere else. And if we drill into the table body here and the table rows, you can see that this table row has a class of success on it. This table row has a class of info. So these colors of these various rows here are coming from Bootstrap classes on each of the rows. So instead of putting a table striped class up here on the table, they're simply using Bootstrap classes like info, warning, and danger right on the table rows themselves. So that tells us that this is the color for success, this is the color for info, this is the color for danger, and you can apply those classes to divs or table rows or buttons and so on. So hopefully by understanding tags, attributes, and what Bootstrap classes look like now, you'll be much more confident when we dive in and start navigating the DOM here and using XPath or CSS to identify the elements we want to interact with.